Good afternoon. I'm Jen Hughes, Design Specialist at the National Endowment for the Arts Design Program. Thank you for joining us today in what will be the first in a series of webinars on the topic of social impact design. Before we get started and I hand you over to our host, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. You are all muted and will only be able to hear us. We will give a PowerPoint presentation followed by a Q&A session. You can submit questions, comments at any time by using the Q&A box below the PowerPoint on your screen. We will do our best to address as many as possible during the time we have today. Please do not use the raise hand button. Welcome to our first NEA webinar on social impact design, creating a culture of storytelling and evaluation. Curated and hosted by thought leaders, the Social Impact Design webinars will build on discussions that began during the Social Impact Design Summit held in February of 2012. The webinars are intended to further enhance the field's capacity to design effectively for social impact. Social impact design is the practice of designing for the public benefit, especially in disadvantaged communities. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to take time to download a recently released white paper, Design and Social Impact, a cross-sectoral agenda for design education, research, and practice. Published by the Smithsonian's Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in conjunction with the National Endowment for the Arts and Lemelson Foundation, this publication sets the stage for exploring key topics in social impact design. Includes a timeline featuring highlights of the field, key players, and proposals for advancing this field of work. As I mentioned, today's webinar is the first in a series on social impact design. We have 2 additional webinars scheduled for June and August, which I invite you to join. All webinars will be recorded and archived to be posted in the podcast, webcast, and webinars section of www.arts.gov, so you can always refer to them in the future. Now, I'd like to hand you over to our guest host for today, John Carey. John is a connector, writer, speaker, and curator focused on social change, with an emphasis on design for the public good. He is the founder of publicinterestdesign.org and most recently was the founding chair of Public Interest Design Week in March 2013 at the University of Minnesota College of Design. He has many accomplishments to speak of, serving as strategic advisor to the $1 million TED Prize and curator of the Autodesk Gallery for an exhibition on design and storytelling. Thank you, John, for hosting us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jen, and it's really great to be a part of this webinar, and especially heartening that the National Endowment for the Arts is focused so much on social impact design these days. We're really going to be talking today about the intersection of design, of impact, and of stories. And we're going to walk through a series of examples to that end that I hope will leave people inspired and informed, and you can walk away with some real practical tools. So this type of work has a long history. The National Endowment for the Arts, as well as its partner, the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, have been a big part of the driving force for the recent surge. And so we have exhibitions like Design for the Other 90%, and its subsequent exhibition focused on the future of cities. We have MoMA's show, Small Scale Big Change, is another big milestone in this type of work. And I think that these 2 in particular, because they have a kind of physical presence and showed a range of projects, really are prime examples of storytelling. We've also seen a proliferation of books, including Design Like You Give a Damn by Architecture for Humanity and these others listed here. But as I was kind of stepping back and looking at some of these efforts to tell stories, I realized that there were a few things that were really missing. The first thing was that mainstream firms, these are people who are working hard in private practices, whether they be architecture, interior design, product design, graphic design practices, were effectively missing from a lot of these efforts. And I think that there are some amazing things happening in the nonprofit design sector, but there are also some amazing public interest efforts and social impact efforts happening within mainstream firms. And so we set about to basically pull the lid off of this type of work that's happening every single day across the design discipline and not just within the nonprofit sector. And so the result of that is a book that I published as a culmination of my work with nonprofit public architecture called The Power of Pro Bono, 40 Stories About Design for the Public Good by Architects and Their Clients. And the book is a breakthrough in really one way. It's not the beautiful design that Polisher at Pentagram did or the beautiful projects that are illustrated here, but it's really that we balanced the narrative of the client or the users with that of the designers. And so every single page has an example like you see on the screen where there's a wide column that shows the client voice and there's a narrow column that always showed the designer's voice, and that was replicated across the entire book. And here's some of the examples. This is the kind of stories that we heard. When we interviewed the designers of multiple libraries that were completed through the Robin Hood Library Initiative, we heard amazing stories about how other contributors had stepped up and made contributions. But we also heard from the actual client and from some actual users about the moment that a little boy walks into the library and feels like he can't touch anything and has never seen a space so beautiful probably in his life. And the next day actually shows up at school with a suitcase packed with his clothes and belongings and says that he wants to live in the library. I mean, that alone, to me, is a much more powerful story than most of us designers could have told about our contributions. And so, of course, there is an important role for designers to speak for themselves, and we're going to talk through that in the next few seconds here. Also, since that book was written, the field, I think, has done a better job of evolving and welcoming in other design disciplines into this picture. The social impact design field has long been dominated by architecture and environmental design, and that's to the credit of those two fields, but it's also to the detriment of the movement generally when we don't make room and a lot of room, I should say, for product design and the design of processes, services, and systems. And so we're going to try to talk through some of those examples today as well. So that brings us to our topic, evaluation and storytelling. And I'm especially excited to have public interest design represented alongside with our partners at TED and the Solutions Journalism Network. Public interest design, for folks that aren't aware of it, is a website and blog that was really intended to create a kind of hub, a communication center for the public interest or social impact design field. You can learn more at publicinterestdesign.org. To date, we've published nearly 700 posts about everything and anything happening within the field, and our Pinterest board is probably the best reflection of that. It tells our story better than our actual website, ironically. This is my handle as well as my website address. There's the Twitter handle for publicinterestdesign.org and the URL as well. We're also extremely honored to have Jamia Wilson here representing TED. TED is short for Technology, Entertainment, and Design, and most people know TED through its TED Talks, its conferences, and a range of other initiatives, but its TED Prize is really one of its kind of hallmark qualities. And that's a new $1 million prize that is conferred annually on an individual with a story or an idea to change the world. And Jamia is the chief storyteller of the TED Prize. You can tweet at her and follow her at Jamia W. That's her personal website. You can also tweet at and follow TED Prize, and that's the website for the tedprize.org. And then finally, our third expert panelist is Courtney Martin, who's a co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network. It is focused on really understanding what is happening in the world and how it works, because there's so many positive things that are working in the world, yet our news is kind of inundated with things that are broken or corrupt or not working in the world. And so her storytelling is really focused on what's working in the world. You can follow Courtney at Courtrights. Also, that's her website, CourtneyMartin.com. And the Solutions Journalism Network has a Twitter handle and its own website, which I encourage you to visit as well. I'm going to be passing back and forth between Jamia and Courtney so you don't get stuck just hearing my voice. But I want to start off just by trying to define in the most simple terms possible what evaluation and storytelling really are. There are lots of fancier definitions, but I found this one on Wikipedia for evaluation being, I think, the most meaningful in terms of evaluation as a systematic determination of a subject's merit, worth, and significance, and really how to go about measuring that. And so stories are but one way to do that. They're kind of anecdotes, but they're often the things that stick with us the most, more than statistics. And so there's a big link between evaluation and storytelling. There's a professor at Harvard who has written extensively and done a lot of research around storytelling, and he describes storytelling as action speech, how we directly translate our values into the motivation to act. And that's Marshall Gans, who you're going to be hearing much more from. He breaks down storytelling into the story of you, the story of us, and the story of now. And we're going to similarly frame our webinar today around those three things and provide some illustrations and some examples. And again, these are things that most often do not operate in isolation. They're connected, as with so many other things in life. Courtney is a big believer in this idea of one's gladness and the need in the world and where those intersect. And Frederick Buechner has, I think, synthesized that well in this quote here. So Courtney's going to lead us off by talking about the story of you.
All right, thank you so much. I did want to give a little more background on Marshall because he's such an extraordinary man and really worth checking out if you all haven't heard of him before. He's a senior lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and he worked on the staff of the United Farm Workers for 16 years before becoming a trainer and organizer for political campaigns, unions, and nonprofit groups. He's credited with devising the successful grassroots organizing model and training that won Barack Obama the 2008 presidential election. So this is a narrative technique. It's about public narrative, but it comes out of a community organizing background, which I think is really important as we talk about design, because so much of what I see as the most cutting edge work in design is about community organizing and about community involvement. So it's cool to think about these things overlapping. So as John said, there's the story itself, the story of us, and the story of now, or the story of you. We can replace the story of self. And the story of self really allows others to experience the values that move us to lead, right? Or in the case of a design project, the story of you is about not you the designer, but you as the client. How was the client transformed by that design? And the important part about this sort of individual narrative is, as we all know, individual narratives are so much easier to process emotionally. The impact of individual narratives is so much easier to process because it is, an emotionally engaging sensory experience for many of us. And, sadly, as we've often heard in history and even in our current events, it can sometimes be very hard to wrap our minds around larger demographic stories because we just have no way in to really conceive of them and identify with them as individuals ourselves. But when you can kind of take this microcosmic example of a story of how one person was changed by a built environment or by a new product, that allows people into the larger story. So it's kind of, looking at that one grain of sand to tell the story of a whole ocean instead of the other way around. So some of the questions that I think can really lead us to key into that are these that John has up on the screen. What was your defining moment? How did it become your moral source? And what does it have to do with your work now? So if you as a designer are telling your story of you, really important to think about, what were those defining moments in the course of your design career? And they might have been very young. They might have not even been when you actually had a career. One moment that John often speaks about, which I think is really relevant here, is that he grew up in a family of 6 kids, so there was always a lot of chaos in his small house. And so from a very young age, he had this sense of how important it was for people to have built environment that respected their way of learning and respected their way of listening. And that's a really important thing for one to hear to understand who John is as a designer, and I've always really thought that was interesting. So think through, kind of plot out, what are some of your defining moments as you've become a designer? How did it become your moral source? And by moral source, I mean, how did that moment teach you something about what people deserve in the world? In the case of John's example, it taught him that, everybody in the world deserves a space where they can hear themselves think, where they can be surrounded by what feels like functionality and beauty to them. And that's gone on as he's, grown up and built this field to be this idea of dignifying design. So that was really rooted in very early moments. And then finally, what does it have to do with your work now? The now piece is so important because it's really what allows the narrative to travel fast and far if people feel there's some kind of sense of urgency. And so related to this idea, what is it about the concept of dignifying design that right now is something that's animating John and making him travel far and wide to try to talk about what people deserve? What is the urgency? What is the cost of not creating that dignifying design? And that really allows, you've already emotionally engaged people, you've already talked to people's moral core, and now you're talking to their sense of urgency, which is so important.
Thanks, Courtney. We're going to walk through just a couple of examples of or illustrations of the story of you. We're going to start with one that publicinterestdesign.org led, and the background on it is that in this field, there are a precious few people that are known, in the media and called on to lecture, and really they, as a result, become kind of stretched thin, while a lot of other people who are contributing great things to the field are not as well known. And yet, not all the people that are working in the social impact design field are designers. There's funders, there's policymakers, there's people who work in communications. There's a whole kind of toolkit of skills that are needed in order to make this field function. And so as a way to showcase that, we identified a range of people, 150 people in all, but that breaks down to 100 individuals and teams. And what we actually found was something that has become noteworthy, especially if people have followed the whole uproar around Denise Scott Brown and the Pritzker Prize, and that revealing the low number of women practitioners in the architecture world. We were able to illustrate here, or tell a story here, about how the social impact design field actually has a higher percentage of women working in it than the traditional mainstream architecture and design professions. And so that's really powerful, and able to illustrate through a mix of graphics and statistics and some narrative, create a story about the composition of this field. And we see that it is national in scope, that there are some areas, the coast, for example, that have a higher number of people working in this area, but that it is still very much a national effort. And in fact, in the next week or so, we'll be launching a global edition of that. And then each individual person has their own story that we try to distill in very, very simple terms. This, in some ways, is kind of like each organization's elevator pitch, which you often hear about from funders and in fundraising workshops. What is your 30 or 20-second pitch about how this work is undertaken, operationalized, and the impact that it's having in the world? And so we tried to tell that story. So that's just one example of storytelling about individuals. And it's actually one that we did externally, but there's, of course, great examples of storytelling that happens from an individual telling their own story. And so I wanted to welcome Jamia Wilson from the TED Prize to talk about her work with TED Prize winners, like this year's winner, Sugata Mitra, and really talk about some of the characteristics that define a TED Prize winner, and anything else Jamia would like to add to that effect.
Thank you so much for having me, John. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you all, and I'm just taking some cues from what Courtney said. I'm really interested in the work that you're doing around public interest design because my grandfather was an architect who wasn't allowed to practice in South Carolina due to segregation after he was trained in New York. And I know that if he were alive to see this movement happening, he would be so excited by it. So I just think this is really great work and wanted to give a bit of my personal story about how all of this is connected as well. But I have the pleasure and privilege of working for the TED Prize, which is $1 million for a wish to inspire the world, $1 million that we give to an extraordinary individual with a creative and a bold vision to spark global change. And in addition to this $1 million, there's also an opportunity to leverage the TED community's resources and get an investment in this powerful idea. And this $1 million and these resources inspire the leaders who become our TED winners to dream bigger about what's possible. And so it's wonderful to be a part of a team where we're working with these winners and people with these great ideas that they now have an opportunity to bring into fruition, to tell the story of their ideas, to get people excited about becoming a part of this story and knowing that we need the investment of all of the people who are participating and then their sharing of their discoveries and stories as well to get more people involved. And so it's wonderful to see this kind of cyclical effect of us telling the story about the winners as well as the stories that come out of the work that people do with us. And you just mentioned Sugata Mitra, who is the most recent winner, whose idea was to reinvent the way that kids learn by defining the future of learning and making sure that child-driven learning is on the forefront of our minds as we think about the way that education works across the globe. And I really highly recommend that you see his talk, but his call to action was for people around the world to create these self-organized learning environments in their communities that are very easy to set up, and getting groups of kids together with his idea that getting groups of kids together with the use of technology can allow them to teach themselves on their own. And we are receiving so many powerful stories from people around the world who are also adding their own experiences to the work and changing the way that we're telling the story about how this can be effective. And this is just exciting to me as well, because we're so open to expanding the story of what this means now that we're receiving stories from other people. So for example, in telling the story of how this model has worked in the past and now that we're expanding it, we're learning that people who are working with kids with special needs are finding extraordinary results in their communities, where some of the kids with special needs in their communities are actually excelling over students who were deemed normal in their classes. And doing better because of this new approach to learning. So it's just wonderful to see how the stories have unique and remarkable returns. But each year, we also need to identify new winners, and we're now in our nominations process, which you're now seeing a slide with the timeline for that, and we're opening it up to find the next winner. So we're really looking for nominees who can share our passion for world-changing ideas. We're counting on people like you to help us nominate visionaries that you respect who are capable of leading a high-impact and collaborative action, as well as people who are great at telling the story of their idea so that they can get people energized to be a part of it. And as you can see in this beautiful infographic, we need people who are inexhaustible, resilient, collaborative, determined, imaginative, and most of all, people who are able to capture imaginations and also make a measurable impact. So we really hope that you'll help us by nominating yourself or someone else. Our nominations open now and are going to be closing in June 1st, and we're really hoping that you will consider nominating yourself or identifying someone whose work you admire that you think could really be helped by leveraging the TED community's resources. And then we will have that wish revealed in February 2014 at the TED conference in Vancouver, British Columbia. And finally, I just wanted to say that you can see this infographic that has the details that you're seeing in the slide at ted.com/prize, and you can click on a link called The Prize in Pictures. But it shows impact stories like the ones that you'll see here, where we've had these initiatives through storytelling have been enlivened to the point where we've been able to raise millions of dollars for ocean protection, help thousands of kids in LA schools to eat healthier, and also inspired thousands of people to engage in the largest participatory art project in the world, which is now the largest art gallery in the world of sorts. And so we really hope that you'll join us and that you'll follow us on Twitter and also join our conversations through some of the live chats that we're hosting to get stories around how people are helping to participate in wishes, as well as nominating yourself or someone else to be the next prize winner.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jamia. We're now going to talk about the second aspect of Ganz's framework, the story of us. And the story of us makes common cause with a broader community whose values we share. And so when we talk about the public interest design field or the social impact design field, we very much try to talk about that inclusively and hope that you all, if you're listening to this, feel like you're a part of something bigger. And there's real power in talking about us in a larger context. And so it's one thing to tell your personal story, and that's really, really important in terms of opening hearts and opening minds. But a critical next step is to talking about how your work fits in a larger context. And so that's where the story of us really, really comes in. You know, Marshall Gans also talks about public narrative in this way, and talks about public narrative as a leadership art through which we translate values into action, engaging heart, head, and hands. And I think that that's a really interesting thing, especially when we talk about designers being makers at the end of the day. And I love the way that he talks about that heart, head, and hand. And just to provide a few illustrations, a couple of illustrations, we're going to first talk about an exhibition that Jennifer Hughes mentioned when we got this all started. It's an exhibition now on display at the Autodesk Gallery in San Francisco, but it has traveled to the TED conference. It'll be traveling internationally, and it showcases products, places, and processes. So again, it goes back to not just environmental design, but also product design and process design. And we really tried to distill that and mark that with these little icons. And it gave us a chance, as we were looking across these different design disciplines, to tell a story about the things, the kind of attributes that are associated with public interest design. So design that is community-driven, that is socially sustainable, that is participatory, and many, many other things in between. Often when I'm asked to talk about public interest design, I talk about public interest design taking a human-centered approach, which is a human-centered design is, of course, probably most closely associated with IDEO and IDEO.org, but they've generously shared a lot of that with the world through their different platforms. And I'll probably go into talking about that in just a minute here. But the key with the story of us is not just talking about values, but really instead creating a narrative that embodies and communicates those values. And so there's a difference there between talking about something in a kind of hypothetical way and using stories and narratives and impact and other metrics to really communicate the results of this type of work. And so I wanted to transition into a quick video here. Anyone listening on the phone will not be able to hear the audio, unfortunately, but I hope you all listening to your computers listen to this carefully now. And of course, we have a big round of applause to give to IDEO.org for that beautiful video. And I think it raises a number of questions that Marshall Gans poses in his framework. The first is, who is the us of your story? Who's the us of our story? So there's the field and the practitioners and the other people that are supporting it, but there's also, and I think more importantly, the users and the community members whose voices are so rarely heard in this field, and in most fields, to be honest. But nonetheless, we can do a much better job of showcasing their very powerful voices. And I think that you'll find that they become huge tools and assets for you to communicate what you do and how you do it. What are your communities or your users defining moments? That video by IDEO.org, which they produced for the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, talks so beautifully about people's everyday experiences. And so we find that it's a really great example. And then finally, how has this shaped your shared moral sources? And how does it allow you to relate with your clients and your users and so on? But I think that there's one quick side story with this, in that we had bumped into the leader of the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, who talked about the work with IDEO.org and basically said, that they had been doing this work for decades, literally, in different forms. And it wasn't until this simple video reminded them to go back to the users, to really think through the way that community members, most often women and girls, use these stoves, how they use them, what they would really like to see in the functionality, that they have seen a lot of breakthroughs. And so that was all attributable in many ways to IDEO.org, which they, of course, would pass on to the users and the community members themselves. And so I want to transition now into the third and final aspect of this, and that's the story of now. And the story of now calls us to act so we can shape the future in ways consistent with our values. The story of now also really underscores the urgency of what we're talking about, like why it's important. And along with that, there's a series of questions which Gans poses, which we can all make use of. What makes the story timely or relevant? What is the challenge or choice? How can you make us the protagonist in action? How can this urgency, this moment, this opportunity really be seized upon? And so those are, I think, are great questions. I want to provide a few illustrations of the story of now. The first being a really simple and quick one, and that's the growth, the incredible growth of the human-centered design network that IDEO.org and the Gates Foundation launched just over a year ago now. They have now attracted over 25,000 users, registered users, who have, from a range of fields, come together and really said, yes, we believe that design matters, that design dignifies, that design can solve some social challenges. And in addition to registering as a user, as a person, there's also the opportunity to tell stories about your projects, what's working in the world, and so on. And so I really encourage you to go to hcdconnect.org to see a lot of this storytelling and evaluation in action. I want to transition as well to the kind of core competency of Courtney Martin, and something that I've really come to believe in, and that's the power of the written word. This is a quote that I love from Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon and a New Yorker columnist. The published word is a declaration of membership in a community, and also of a willingness to contribute something meaningful to it. And so it's one thing to do the very important work on the ground every day, and this field would be nothing without that work. But it's another thing to be able to tell a story to the broader public and to funders and to potential clients and other people that don't understand that design is within their reach or within their access. And writing is a very, very effective way to do that. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney Martin to talk a little bit, very briefly, and distill what is normally multiple days of training into a few minutes here. Courtney can be followed at Court Rights. That's her website. Solutions Journalism, which is the kind of culmination of her talk, can be followed in these two places. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney Martin.
Thanks again. And I just want to reference that a lot of what I'll be saying in this little section actually derives from some work I do with an organization called the OpEd Project, which I really encourage all of you to check out. It's at theopedproject.org, and it was founded in order to diversify thought leadership all over the world, particularly training women and people of color how to enter the thought leadership debate, which is just such a valuable mission generally. You know, a solutions journalism story, which is another piece of the work I do, is really about correcting for the fact that journalists have failed the public for a long time in covering very well and very thoroughly what doesn't work about the world, all of the you know, painful stories that we mostly see in the headlines every day, but we've pretty much done a terrible job of covering what does work. And we're at this unprecedented moment when there's a tremendous amount of social entrepreneurship and citizen-oriented activism all over the world, and we've largely missed the story. Which is not only bad for sort of social change generally, but is also just sort of unethical because journalism was created to shed a light on what's really happening in the world, and we're missing half of what's happening. So the Solutions Journalism Network, which is co-founded with two New York Times columnists, David Borenstein and Tina Rosenberg, is all about trying to correct for this mistake. And solutions journalism stories, just like any other kind of investigative story, look at what the deeper causes of social problems are, but then moves on to describe a response to those problems. It analyzes and explains the how and why of those responses. And most journalism is obsessed with the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, why, as you all probably know. But the how is really where we learn, right? If we can cover, for example, a story about how DREV created prosthetic knees, and not just turn it into a fluff story, but really say, how did they figure out this delivery method? How did they iterate? You know, what were the roadblocks for them? How did they get over them? Then other organizations, other designers can learn from that and really apply it to our own work. It makes all of us smarter. These kinds of stories put the response in a broader context. So it's not just about this one hero worshiping entrepreneur. It's about what is this whole field doing and how can we all be smarter and do it better. It definitely provides critical analysis, so it's not just about celebrating those solutions, it's also about looking at their faults and looking at their challenges. It generates curiosity and hopefully has good tension. We don't want this to be the broccoli of journalism. We really want it to be just as compelling as the exposés. We want there to be real interesting characters and real kind of how-done-its, as we like to put it, in terms of how things get solved. And we like to look at experts, not just those who are sort of at the policy level or in universities behind Ivy League walls, but those who are really on the ground, grassroots experts, and focus a lot more on the value of the idea than on charisma or talent of the people behind it, as I said. We like to set this apart from sort of the good news journalism that a lot of people think is solutions journalism, but is really just, you know, telling the nice story about someone who helped an old lady across the street. And that is, you know, it makes us all feel good, but it doesn't make us much smarter. Next slide, Jen. So these are the 3 critical questions that every editor is asking themselves when they see a story come across their desk. Those 3 questions are, so what, why now, and why me? Or why you, in the case of the editor asking the person themselves. So one of the things we do at the OpEd Project is try to train people to write op-eds and submit them themselves, which is a great way. You know, it's one thing to get journalists to cover the work you're doing, which is obviously very valuable, but it's actually a really difficult thing to do. Most journalists hate being pitched. They like to discover things themselves. So it's not really an easy thing for most designers to be proactive about in terms of getting covered. What you can be really proactive about is writing your own op-eds, getting your own story out there. And when you pitch an op-ed or you submit an op-ed, the 3 questions you should be asking yourself are right here. So, you know, I want to write about my project. I think everyone should know it, how interesting it is. But what's the so what? What's the larger context? What was the gem that you learned that is actually going to apply to many other projects and potentially even many other fields? So there always has to be that big zoom out in your op-ed. You can't just talk about your own work or it just seems like self-promotion. And then the why now. This gets back to the story of now that we were talking about in Ganza's terms. The media runs based on news pegs, based on this idea that there has to be a reason why we would run this story right now. And you know, the media likes to pretend like that is this very fixed official idea. It's actually a totally creative, fungible idea. So the better you get at figuring out how to make a connection between what you want to talk about and what is going on in the world, the more powerful you will be. And let me give you an example. So the Denise Scott Brown case is a great example. All of a sudden there's this spark of interest in inclusivity in architecture, gender in architecture, race in architecture. So any story that you've been wanting to tell that relates to any of those things could link to what's happening with Denise Scott Brown. That's your why now. And it may seem very arbitrary to you, but that's how the media works, and editors really respond to this. And the why me is really very personal. It gets back to this question of why should you of all people be writing this? If you're writing about your own work, obviously you can argue I'm the person that knows the most about my own work. But there might be something about your personal background that really makes you compelling, and it's good to share that in the op-ed and or in the picture submission. So most op-eds are 750 words. That's sort of the rule of thumb. And some are longer, some are shorter, but it's good to shoot for that word length. And one of the most important concepts to incorporate if you are going to attempt to write an op-ed is this concept to be sure. And this basically, you may even, as I'm saying that, think to yourself, oh yeah, that does show up in a lot of the op-eds I read. The to be sure is basically taking into account who is your ideological opponent, right? So if you're making an argument about, there needs to be more funding in design, try to put into your mind, who's the person that doesn't think there needs to be more funding in design? Is it the skeptic who thinks design is an overblown field and what kind of impact does it really have? Is it the person who says, design is really a luxury, we need to feed people? They're much more basic needs. And then address that opponent yourself. Be proactive about addressing that ideological opponent before they have to address you, right? It's a very powerful technique and one that a lot of people, many of the most important figures in history have used to great effect. And the most important part of this is assume this ideological opponent is moral and intelligent, right? You assume that they're coming from a place of really believing what they believe from a good faith place, as opposed to just dismissing them. And that's going to make your argument stronger just by the basis of you assuming that about them. Sorry, I'm losing my breath a little here. So finally, I wrote this book called Do It Anyway, The New Generation of Activists, and I was really interested in looking at why people do what they do, particularly those who are trying to make a difference in the world in some way. And what it really came down to is this concept that, we all need to do more work that makes us come alive. And having our deep gladness meet up with the world's deep need is what the world really needs. Howard Thurman, who's a great liberation theologian, said what the world needs is people who come alive. So, and that's what people want to see in your writing. That's what people want to see in your op-eds. That's what funders want to see is what about the work really makes you come alive.
Thanks, Courtney, and thanks, Jamia. And so, as you can see in this next slide, this is how we've tried to position storytelling and evaluation in terms of this intersection of you, us, and now. And we hope that you're able to pull from some of what you've learned here and reflect back on your own stories in order to more effectively communicate the impact of your work and consider the impact on the people you're trying to serve. And so I want to thank you all for being a part of this presentation. I know it's sometimes difficult to listen to a one-way presentation. It's equally difficult to deliver a one-way presentation, we'll tell you. But we wanted to make sure that there was ample time for questions, and we've already seen quite a few come in through the Q&A. And so I would encourage you to use the box that should be on your screen where you can enter a question and we can start responding to some of these. There was somebody that I know joined the question late, and joined the webinar late, and wanted to know if the slides and the videos will be available, and they will be archived on the NEA website, and we'll remind you of the exact location of that toward the end of the call. We've also had a question, a perfectly legitimate one, about whether or not there would be a certificate conferred after this webinar, and that's not the case. This is really just a kind of public information, public education effort on the part of the NEA, but there are other efforts, including the Public Interest Design Institute and some degree granting programs that are very much focused on the same type of work. So would encourage you to check those things out. In terms of other questions, we had one about what is the difference between public interest design and social impact design, and that is a great, perfectly legitimate question. It's one that I've also struggled with as we've seen other terms kind of rise, but in particular, what I try to do is liken public interest design to public interest law, which is a very well-known field or aspect of a field, the legal profession. And it can also be likened to public health, which is kind of the public interest arm of the medical field. And none of those terms, public interest law, public interest health, and public interest design, are really that sexy. Social impact, in my mind, actually sounds a lot more sexy, but it can also sound to some people to be more activist, which is something that I might personally embrace, but other people might not. And so we think that there's actually a lot of common language and a ton of common ground across all these different terms. And most recently, my colleague Gilad Maron and I published a glossary of terminology in Good Magazine, which you can find at publicinterestdesign.org/glossary, that has upwards of 30 different terms that are effectively all being used to describe the same thing. And so that could be, in some people's minds, a great next step for this field, is to coalesce around a single term. But for the time being, I think the key message, especially if you're being asked by funders or clients or the media or others, is this common ground. There's a ton that we're talking about in slightly different terms, but it's basically saying the same thing. And so there have been other questions raised, and maybe some of these might pull in Jamia and Courtney around how do we measure success. And I think that there's ways you can measure this quantitatively. There are real statistics that you can derive from how many people are using a product, or how many people have continued to use it after they were initially outfitted with it. DREV, Design Revolution, does a great job of measuring impact, but it is something that a lot of funding doesn't pay you to do, and so they've benefited from a full-time director of impact that's been made available to them through the seed fund at Stanford University, and as a result they have really compelling data for the use of their prosthetic knee joint, for example, and some of the other products that they have in circulation. And so those are just a couple of my thoughts about it, but maybe Courtney or Jamia might have some thoughts about measuring success.
This is Courtney. I'm sure Jamia has some thoughts on this too. I would say, there's the obvious breakdown of quantitative and qualitative, and there are lots of ways to measure quantitative success. If it's a built environment, was sort of money brought in terms of different businesses. I know the figures around the High Line, for example, are just totally amazing in those terms, in terms of the way that it built up the geographical area in which it was placed and attracted new businesses and stuff like that. I think the qualitative, which is really what we're talking about today through storytelling, is a much harder form of measurement. And as I noticed someone asked a question about resources, a much more resource-intense form of measurement at times. But it's one that is very moving for funders, and I think a lot of them, even if they proclaim to want all the numbers, really do get moved by the stories. It's a thing that sticks in their craw that they can't sort of stop thinking about, and so I think it's worth the investment, it's worth the effort to get those qualitative stories. There are a lot of folks who work in the development field who know way more than I do about exactly how to frame those and pose those and package them. But I think at the very minimum, it's really worth doing post-occupancy interviews with people in built environments, post-usage interviews with people in terms of products or systems that you're working on design-wise. And that's the kind of thing that even a really talented intern can do. It doesn't have to be someone whose labor is going to cost a lot of money, but I think it's just so worth getting a transcript of people's actual experiences of the design that you've created.
Jamia, would you like to add anything around that?
I think everything that was said was spot on, and I really just believe that if we're thinking about cultural change, then we really know that the qualitative piece is so important. And yes, it's harder to document, but I think that there's some very tangible ways that we can start to see the ways that things are changing when we look back, and just really to think about when we're creating a vision about how we're going to aggregate the stories and keep an archive of the stories so that we can go back and see where this incremental change has happened. And I also think there's a lot of really great digital storytelling devices out there now that can actually help us understand metrics and find out how our stories are resonating with people and what people are really interested in them as well. So I think it's about really experimenting with a lot of different tools and being okay with experimenting with a lot of different ways to tell story, and embracing that, and sometimes there will be challenges and failures, but a lot of times there will be surprises and a lot of gifts from that. And I'll just say one thing that we're doing right now at TED is that we work together on a toolkit that was kind of telling the story of how to implement Sugata Mitra's educational model that we talked about before. And while that was something that was a methodology, and there's a lot of different quantitative ways that we can survey people around the effectiveness of that tool, we're actually finding out more about the effectiveness of it in terms of changing people's lives, impacting the way that kids learn by receiving these qualitative stories. So in addition to surveying people in more traditional methods, we're juxtaposing that with aggregating stories through digital storytelling, creating opportunities for us to have forums to engage with people who are practicing and using these tools, and finding a lot of different ways to connect with the people who are doing this work in different places. And I think it just creates a richer overall result because we're able to balance the quantitative with the real felt experiences that people are having. But also when we're thinking about how we present statistics as well, we're thinking about how we infuse story into that and making sure that the way that we talk about the numbers is vibrant, and that there's a humanized way of telling the story of the statistics when we're presenting them as well, which I think is really important.
Great. And there's another question somewhat related to this that Jamia might also have some insight around, and that's that the statement that preceded it was that storytelling can take a great deal of resources and talent, especially to produce really good stories, and that often these organizations that are working in the space are stretched very thin with resources and funding, and storytelling seems to be one of the first things to get cut out of the project budget. And so the question is, how can we, as an organization or collectively, advocate for storytelling and justify the necessary resources? I'm wondering, Jamia, if you have thoughts about that, given your work with the Women's Media Center and/or with TED.
Sure. I think it's great that you mentioned this, because having worked at a Women's Media Center and us having a lot of discussions around the fact that funding that exists around media oftentimes did not exist around funding media accountability campaigns specifically for marginalized groups. And so that was really tough because in some spaces as well, there's just people's portfolios haven't been built in mind to think about those kinds of endeavors as projects that they would fund. So I think that it is really tricky, and I've had experience with that. But what I've found is that now that technology is changing so fast, and when people see how the media landscape has become increasingly content-driven, and there's more need for portable, transferable content that is easy to get and quick and fast and ready, and less of this content is being driven directly from outlets, and more of it's coming from communities, freelancers, as well as digital content that exists, citizen journalists, et cetera. It provides an opportunity. So what I think is that there can be a case that it's made in each different organizational context to talk about what the key discourses are that are happening around the work that you're doing, and where those discourses are centered, because oftentimes those are going to be in the media, and those are going to be in specific digital spaces, and using that to really talk about how making that investment could position your organization or your work within the forefront of that, and that could have longer-term impacts in terms of having funders interested in your work. One thing I have found out too is that at Women's Media Center, a lot of the funders that we worked with were really interested in the kinds of coverage that we were receiving, so that it's an expectation also to be able to present stories and how you're presenting story, and that there's a lot of interest in the funding community around how people are doing that they're starting to recognize the importance of that work. So I think that investing those resources should be considered, in my opinion, like how you decide to invest in a development personnel role.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's a great point. I mean, I think what you've touched on, Jamia, and you could apply it to development, you could apply it to overhead, you could apply it to general operating. But I think most people that are listening to this call have had, at one point or another, potentially even this week, to defend why design is worth investing in, especially when there's these other bigger social challenges or budgetary needs. And so for anyone that's got used to responding to that, I think you could use that same messaging around making the case of why storytelling matters. And I think that one of the key ways to do that is to show that through storytelling, you are going to be able to better advocate for the people that you're trying to serve. You're going to you're going to empower them to speak with their own voice rather than relying on you or others to translate. And I think that that's exactly the kind of thing that should and would resonate with funders and other donors that are critical to supporting this kind of work. So there's been another question, and we have about 4 minutes left here. There's been another question, and a series of them actually, around blogging and around the use of new media, social media. One of the things that we really encourage, and Jamia touched on this earlier, was to experiment about what works and what's effective for you, what you're good at, and what is the most useful in terms of the larger context of the social media world. And I've never, there's some organizations that will excel at blogging and will develop huge followerships. There's some that will do a much better job focusing on Twitter or on Facebook or on creating videos through a dedicated channel on YouTube or Vimeo. But you should not feel compelled as an individual or an entity to do all of those things. You should probably focus on what you can do really, really well, and then as you begin to master that, perhaps introducing other things. There are some basic tools for integrating your blog that every time you blog, a tweet goes out for you, so you don't have to remember to do that. But through technology, we have many, many more resources to be able to do this. There was also a question about how to connect with other bloggers. There are some kind of aggregate resource lists that you can find. One of them is at publicinterestdesign.org/links. And that's not a comprehensive list. There really is no such thing. But if there are ones that you find missing, you're welcome to email us and recommend those. And then finally, there have been some questions raised about how to basically make the case that designers have a role to play in communities as opposed to community members doing a lot of this work themselves. There's a balancing act, I think, associated with that, and I think that as a trained professional, as an educated professional, you have a lot of credibility and a lot of legitimacy going in and offering your services, whether those are pro bono or in some cases fee-based services. And I think the key is just to show that you empathize with the clients and the users, that you hear them, that you allow them to speak for themselves, and that it's very much a balancing act. A designer would not do a perfect job all by themselves, nor would a community member or a user or a client without the support of one another. It's really about combining forces and knowledge and resources in order to make good things happen in the world. So I think perhaps on that note, with 1 minute left, I just want to remind everyone that you can go to find an archive of this webinar under at the arts.gov website, www.arts.gov, and then you can go to podcasts, webcasts, and webinars section, and there will be an archive shortly available for this webinar. And the future ones are promoted on that website and will also be archived there. But I would like to close by thanking our two other panelists, Courtney Martin, an author and journalist, as well as Jamia Wilson with the TED Prize. And we'll probably turn it back to Jennifer Hughes with the National Endowment for the Arts. Thank you.
Thank you so much to John, Courtney, and Jamia. This has been a very informative conversation. And as John mentioned, we'll have it ready for archive, and we invite you to join us on June 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our next webinar in the Social Impact Design webinar series. Thanks again, and have a great day.